The ugly truth behind China's rise. China was a poor country in 1980, and it has grown into the second largest economy of the world, in about 4 decades. What's the number one reason for this rise? The answer may shock you. Well, let's give some background. China had extremely poor infrastructure with roads, bridges, dams, highways, trains, ports, etc. in 1980. During the growth of China, almost everything changed to the level of an advanced economy, at least in the Chinese urban areas. The infrastructure improved at such a level that China boasted of the world's longest bridges, biggest dams, largest high-speed rail network, and high-end expressways. How did it happen so quickly? You may think that China became the manufacturing hub of the world, and that was the reason they had the money to build the infrastructure. Not really. This does not explain the trillions of dollars that were needed to upgrade China's infrastructure. Apart from that, at some point in the early 2000s, the labor cost of China increased much higher than in competing nations like Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, and Philippines. And how did China keep the manufacturing base still competitive and offer cheaper price than the competitors? The answer is simple. It was done by providing trillions in incentives to the manufacturing units. The question that pops in your head now is, how did China have so much money for building the infrastructure while providing the incentives to its industries? And as we have seen, both require trillions of dollars each. But there is more. China also decided to pump in money in new industries, like solar power, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and 5G. These industries required massive amount of money from the government in the form of tax credits, low-interest loans, and incentives, again in the trillions. China was able to provide money to these new industries too. Are we done? No. Not even close. China spent trillions on military, internal security, space programs, hypersonic missiles, spreading communist ideologies by funding Western education institutions, creating artificial islands in South China Sea, buying large mines all over the world, etc., etc. If you think they must have taxed their way out to spend on all these projects, here is a surprise for you. China had the lowest tax structure for the corporates, and the incentives and tax breaks given to these businesses were massive. And finally, here is the cherry on the cake, when it came to China's spending, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI for short. BRI is a project that cost almost $3 trillion for China so far. The money, which was given as loans to very poor nations around the globe, was supposedly spent on improving the infrastructure of these nations. These nations had no way of repaying these loans, and China hopes to take hold of their territory and set up their military bases. The BRI project made China's overall spending increase to an astronomical amount. How did China find all the money for this level of spending? Now, we'll let you know the dirty little secret. And it's simple. China printed the most amount of money in the history of mankind. For all those citizens who are frustrated with the US, EU, or the UK when their government keeps printing money to spend on populist measures, you should be happy, you are not living in China. China outdid all the Western nations combined when it came to printing money. In the modern world, money is not printed physically in large quantities. Most of the money that comes into circulation is in the digital form. So, let's define some terms for you. There is something called M0 money, and this is the actual paper money plus coins that are in circulation, also known as fiat currency, added to the monetary base, held by the central banks. Then there is the M1 money, which is called the narrow money supply. This includes all the M0 money plus the demand deposits. The next is M2 money. The M2 money, or the broad supply of money, includes the M1 money, plus the money market shares, as well as the savings deposits. We'll stop here. The M2 money is still liquid, unlike real estate, or other assets, which are not liquid money. Liquidity of the money is a measure of how quickly it can be cashed, if needed. So, let's compare the M2 money that is printed, or in circulation, between the US and China. Let's take the 3 decades between 1990 to 2020, for comparison, and we'll use the official published data. It has to be noted though both the US and China have printed significantly large sums of money since then. M2 money supply of the US in 1990 was $3 trillion. Using the exchange rate of that time, between the US dollars to the Chinese currency, renminbi, also known as yuan, the equivalent M2 money of China in 1990 was $135 billion. M2 money supply of the US in 2020 was $19 trillion. M2 money supply of China in 2020 was $33.25 trillion, again, using the appropriate exchange rate of the time. The growth of M2 money, or the broad money supply in the US, is a little over 6 times, during the 30 years between 1990 to 2020, but the M2 money supply of China has grown about 250 times. How did this M2 money supply grow in China so much? The Chinese economy didn't grow at the same level of their M2 money supply. The simple answer is, China just kept printing money like it was nobody's business. Also, the figures we published here are official numbers, given by Chinese government, and we never know if these numbers are real, and if the true numbers are much worse than this. This printing of money, which created a huge money supply, was critical for China, in providing support to all the industries we had mentioned earlier. When you print so much money, you have enough for building the dams, the bridges, the large expressways and highways, large real estate projects, the largest high-speed rail networks, modernize and build the military, maintain a tight grip on the society through internal security, provide plenty of funds for scientific research, provide massive subsidies to businesses to reduce prices, more than its competitors, and spare a few trillions as loans as well, to poorer nations and trap them with debt, which they can't repay. Remember, the US is a larger economy than China, roughly by about 1.6 times larger than China. So, with such a large M2 supply, China has actually not used its money wisely, and hence had only created a lower GDP, despite the higher level of money printing. Lastly, you may ask, why didn't the international organizations, Wall Street pundits, financial institutions, hedge fund managers, foreign governments, who invested in China, care about this gaping hole in the Chinese economic infrastructure? Simple. They were busy profiting from the myth that was created about China's unending growth story, which was extrapolated over multiple decades into the future. And that's the ugly secret to China's miraculous economic rise. This explains why no other country can replicate this model. We'll look at the consequences of China's mistakes in financial management, and its effects on the long-term growth of China, and its impact on the world at large, in a separate video. Thanks for watching.